Anyway, having said that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. It's Dr. Noel Purcell, and Noel has served as a senior executive of Westpac since February 1986 in a variety of roles. He's currently the Group General Manager, Stakeholder Communications, with responsibility for all media, government, investor and community relations, as well as the Westpac Group Corporate Sustainability and Internal Communication. Prior to joining Westpac, Noel served at senior executive levels with the Federal Public Service, including the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, the Office of National Assessments and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Noel gained his PhD from the University of Michigan and also completed the Advanced Management Program at Harvard University and the Strategic Marketing Program at Stanford University. Noel recently joined the Global Governing Board. Now, I don't know this acronym, Noel. Do I say COUX or CO? Okay. Noel recently joined the Global Governing Board of the CO Roundtable and is chairman of the Deployment Committee of the CO Roundtable. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Noel Purcell. Thank you.
One moment. If something is wrong with the computer, we can put it back on the different one. So, bear with us.
Just violated every OHS principle by falling over the court.
Well, you can keep talking though.
Oh, okay. Once upon a time. I put my mobile phone here to remind myself to turn my mobile off, so if you'd like to do the same, that would be greatly appreciated, just out of respect of, for the people who are speaking. And, hey, this gives me more time to proselytise, doesn't it? You tell me when you're ready, Noel. You are ready?
I'll keep talking. I'll start talking as well.
Okay.
Well, okay.
Shall I have to use this? Is that right?
Yes, because we can do that.
Okay.
Well, while they're starting, how many actually involved in the board? How many readers? The whole lot of players. We've got context for that. Sorry about that. So what if this obviously will be a chat. So I'm quite happy if people can go through, want to dialogue, if they go through, probably better than holding it again for 10 minutes. So please game up in the right talk. I'm quite happy to know that way. Look out for me to make sure I get through what we can get through. So I'm quite happy to work that way if you like. Yeah. Computer share or
I'm from BITC Australia, student group, so running entrepreneurial leadership programs.
Okay, look, thanks. It looks like we're underway. Sorry about all that. Thought I'd start a bit. Sorry, I'm supposed to use this. I hate standing up here. But, no, it's all right. I'll stay still. I thought I'd start with this because it really brings home to me. It's a cartoon from a number of years ago from Alan Moyer. And it was probably written about us at the time when probably 6 odd years ago where there was starting to be noise around that Westpac was engaging in corporate responsibility, and I think this depicted the cynicism and unbelief of it all. Pigs will fly, you know. Amazing a bank promise of social responsibility. So in many ways we can really ask the question, I think, and some of the stuff we'll talk about today, are the pigs still flying? And in some ways they still are, although there's been dramatic change over the last 6 to 7 years, and particularly in terms of the degree to which companies are now, at least at the big end of town, are now starting to engage in more formalised reporting, assurance and measurement processes, albeit the challenges in this area, as we'll talk about, are quite large and quite complex. I thought I'd start though just to share some thoughts I've had about really the background to this, and it helps to reflect how time changes so rapidly, but and David would know this too, but when I think about the pre-1990s, the world was dominated by PR-driven worlds, and you know, the PR companies were everywhere. In fact, in corporations, it was tended to be called the public relations department. And it was all about perception management. It was message-driven. Companies really felt and had a fair ability to control the agenda in those days. It was, at best, reactive issue management, and there was plenty of spin. And the prevailing view in if I had to summarise it, was that we've got all the answers. And of course, this was pre-internet, and so pre-electronic and digital communications, and so dramatic different environment. And through the 90s, I'd call it the stakeholder aware phase, where at least the progressive companies came to the view that perhaps they got all the answers. Companies started to feel that they'd lost control of the agenda, that they were struggling with not only their own workplace and employees, but certainly the community seemed to suddenly rise up and start to have a voice. Trying to control information was extremely difficult, and so we saw the beginning of engagement by corporations into around these issues, particularly in the community dimension. Values and behaviours re-emerging as fairly critical issues. Hi guys, big night. Hey David, how are you? No, that's right. Now I've got an expert here, so if I get into trouble, I'll ask David to speak up. So as I say, values and behaviours were re-emerging through the 90s. It was people getting into that it was about reality, not rhetoric, which mattered. And of course the new media, that is electronic communications, internet, and so on, were beginning to dominate. And I think as we look at this decade, I typify it as the stakeholder responsive decade. And again, the smart ones, the progressive companies at the front end. And let me say through this, I assume that some will give people or put up websites or whatever, or if it's not, you want copies of any of this, just happy to send it to you or whatever. Don't worry about trying to copy everything down if you don't want to. And I think for companies like us, it's very much, it's what are the questions? And I'll come to talk a bit about that. So we find ourselves very much not assuming that we, let alone know the answers, or someone else has got them, but very much we're into what are the questions. It's very much about engagement and responsiveness being at the core of what we do. It is certainly principles and values driven. The focus is on reputational legitimacy, and there are complex trade-offs in all of this, which is really the issue. So we back model this, but I think in a very simplistic way it sometimes tells just how fundamental things have changed in a relatively short period. As I said, I think it's a pity for the younger ones amongst us here that they didn't experience the pre-90s, because they don't have the context of just how fundamentally different it is. But it is a very different world. So where are we at? And I put the title up there, Well Beyond Compliance. And this is the shifts. I want to talk about some of the shifts we've seen on the dimension of honesty. The previous paradigm was very much around the passive legal side, not lying, being factually true, correct to the letter. Whereas where we're moving to, where I think companies need to move to, where this debate's moved to, is very much on the active and ethical side. So around the whole truth to the spirit, which is fundamentally different to correct to the letter of the law. On the dimension of transparency and disclosure, moving from the passive legal side of need to know, compliance, disclosure, compliance driven, to the right to know and complete disclosure. And I use complete in the sense of you understand the context I'm using that there. On the dimension of demonstration and engagement, again, the big shift from information exclusive, narrowly defined, to engagement, very inclusive and broadly defined agendas. And then finally, on the area of respect, from around compliance-driven messages to suit the moment, to accountability-driven and clear and consistent messaging. So I'll just go back to that. So fundamental big shifts, and the reason I'm taking some time about this before I go on to the woes and pros of reporting is that this is fundamental to understanding why reporting's, where it's coming from, what the context of it is. When we look at this, we in our place talk about concept of total reporting. Others talk, the early days of triple bottom line. You hear about extended reporting. There's a whole lot of words evolving around this stuff. But the things that drive us around this is that boards, in fact, do have a very, very broad mandate for the oversight of corporate performance. There is still a big debate in this country, as you know, that we've got two inquiries going on, the Parliamentary Joint Committee, which is looking at directors' obligations, etc., and the CAMAC one. And there are different views around, but unfortunately the minority these days try to define board or director responsibility in a narrow sense. But undoubtedly, the Westpac view of the world is there is a very broad mandate and a very broad sense of responsibilities in this area, which means that the directors must understand the true value drivers, the risk and the opportunities in the business. They in fact have an obligation to the corporation to do so. And our belief that stakeholders need the information to fully assess the company's performance, not only via the traditional financial paradigm, but also from the non-financial metrics. In our case, and it's pretty typical of corporations these days, around 70% of our market value is so-called intangibles. That is, the tangible assets, the net tangible assets only define 30% of our market value. So there's 70%, which really can't be fully explained by the detailed financials, and hence why this is important and why the stakeholders, and particularly investors, do need access to much more information. So, pictures of our latest reports there. I also just want to say what this is, because I think I'm talking to an informed audience here from when everybody said where they worked. But it's often worth repeating this, that a lot of people get stuck in this top box and think that this stuff is simply about wider community involvement. And I'm sure there's not many in this room who think that anymore. That while community investment and commercial initiatives in the community are absolutely important, they are not what this is fundamentally about. They are, in fact, the bit on the top in my view. What this is fundamentally about is about the core business processes and practices and reporting on those in detail. And I use the analogy, no one quite remembers what HIH's community programs were, nor ANZET's, nor Enron's or anybody else for that matter. What we remember is they were fundamentally rotten at the core. So their core business processes and practices were what the real issues are. So that's fundamentally what corporate responsibility, in my view, or corporate social opportunity is all about. But increasingly it's all about issues in the value chain. In our case these days, around 30% of our expense base is outsourced in some form. So we partner very deeply with organisations from EDS, IBM, are the big ones, Telstra, and so on. And so to the extent that they're managing material issues in the social environmental spectrum, that's a critical part of our total performance. And so sustainable supply chain management is increasingly important, and it's important in the reporting area. Our philosophy in this whole area, which is a very funny cartoon which Alan Moyer did do, we got him to draw some for our last year's stakeholder impact report, and I think it sums up what was going on a lot on the corporate governance area with boards. Quite a good depiction, and the community sitting outside wondering what's going on. But the philosophy is very much about, in our case, to support and attempt to use existing and emerging frameworks. One, and particularly around GRI, but also, as people know, we've been strong supporters of and involved in, and in fact I just finished a conference call at 6 a.m. this morning with our friends at BITC, who are starting a review with Arthur D. Little of the Corporate Responsibility Index, and because we've been, as I say, a key supporter, but also wanting to move things into consistent reporting frameworks, etc. Because it does allow peer reviews, it allows you to get good benchmarking, and it also allows building a critical mass. So again, I'll mention some of that about the need for convergence, a lot of this stuff as we move forward. We also, our philosophy is to build around and understand our stakeholder needs through formalised engagement. A critical part of this is just not for the sake of compliance, doing external reporting, if it's in fact not fundamentally linked to redefining internal reporting processes. So one of the great gains you get out of this is actually the transparency it creates internally around issues. And when I look at, we report in detail in our stakeholder impact reports, something like 120, 130 individual indicators, and every one of them are value drivers. Every one of them can be managed to value. And a large number of those weren't very transparent internally before we started doing this stuff. The other thing is, as a matter of underlying principle, we do subject everything we do, the data, the underlying systems, etc., to very detailed independent verification and assurance. And I wouldn't argue you need to do this in year one, but I do argue that you very need to quickly move in and make sure. And again, I'll come back and say a few things about that to you. Also encouraging external scrutiny through assessments and ratings. People have often asked me, why do you go through this trauma and why do you do so many of these things? It has just been absolutely critical to us, the feedback loop that we get from it, the critique, the benchmarking we can obtain, so participation in Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the CRI Index, etc., 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 Reputex, all of those to us are learning loops. I won't say a lot about this, I mentioned already, but Eye on the Reporting Future. We do have 2 current federal government inquiries looking into non-financial reporting at the moment. There is quite a movement going on. There's activities at the Institute of Company Directors. The ASX are re-looking at things. So, and as we particularly look in Europe and UK and now in the States. So this is really starting to happen. I put up there the UK Operating and Financial Review. We think that's an interesting development because, one, it's not a prescriptive requirement, it's a non-prescriptive requirement, but interesting enough, I think 2 days ago the world's changed suddenly, and with a lot of criticism, where the government has now decided in the UK that this won't be compulsory, that it is voluntary. I think it's a pity that's happened, because I think unless people are doing this, directors are not fulfilling their actual obligation. Their fiduciary obligations, statutory obligations, if they don't do this in any event. But having said that, producing an OFR now in the UK is actually going to be voluntary, and that was a development of literally 2 days ago. As I said, it's a pity it's gone that way, but so be it, that's the way it is. But I do think, irrespective of being voluntary, I think it's going to be like the ASX corporate governance, good principles for corporate governance. The pressure will be on all major companies to produce an OFR. So I think de facto it'll still happen. A quick oversight of what we do. As I said, I mentioned already the importance of internal reporting. So, and for us, a critical element of this whole journey and process around reporting has been the fact that fairly early on, the board took the decision to set up what is now called the Board Corporate Responsibility and Sustainability Committee. It's been a critical part of this journey because having that sort of instrument in place means that there is rigorous internal reporting around all of these issues right across the spectrum, and so that's been a big aid. Obviously, on a total performance basis, we, as you probably know, we now integrate our sustainability reporting with our financial reporting. There's a gap of about 1 month between, but by the time the AGM's around, which is on the 15th of this month, our new sustainability report will be out, and it sits juxtaposed with the financial report, the annual financial report. We thought about trying to merge the two, but I think, and some companies have actually attempted to do that. We blend the two rather than merge. I think it's still too complex to try to merge. I'll put in there the GRI AA1000, which is the assurance standard, etc. So they form, if you like, the package of our total reporting. And then the external assessments, I've just put some examples. So that's really the overview of the reporting activity. I want to say that we don't do this in isolation. The other point I want to stress is that formal engagement is absolutely critical. I've just put a schematic up here, and it's actually not complete. There's been some changes and further fleshing out of this. But it does show you that while this looks to be a complex engagement structure, it in fact is something we've let evolve. A critical part is that part up until the middle top, the Community Consultative Council, which actually, and I'll show you some examples, which actually sets really our sustainability agenda for us. They actually go through and tell us what they see the material issues in the financial, social and environmental dimension. Issues, for example, of the flow-ons from ageing the population, climate change issues to do with estrangement particularly in our outer suburbs and our cities and so on, things that Dave and others are working on. Issues in the disability space, etc. So they come in and we have this, which David Morgan, our CEO, chairs, and we literally sit down and have this dialogue around what are the emerging issues which are fundamental to our communities in which we're seeking to operate. And that goes in and actually forms the structure of the emerging issues and material issues of which we attempt to look at how we're operating as a business and what we want to report back against. So I'll show you an example of that. So I won't go through the detail of that. A lot of these groups, the supplier group, the employee networks, the environmental advisory groups, they're groups that operate extremely well in our company, but they're also groups which we've actually let evolve from a voluntary perspective. They are not things that David Morgan or the board decided to set up a committee on this. We actually developed it at a grassroots level, and we got people to opt in who one, are motivated in this area, but who have job responsibility in this area but want to see it in a broader context. And so these groups have just developed while we have charters for them, but they've developed in an informal way as coalitions, and it's been really successful. I said this is the type of issues which have come out of last year's, it's only a snapshot, but have come out of last year's Community Consultative Council meeting. So these are the type of things that the groups and the groups run from the ACTU to and the FSU, of course, our own union, through to the Australian Consumer Association, St James Ethics Centre, Smith Family, our community, heads of a couple of federal departments are the key ones in this space, City of Melbourne, so it goes on. There's about 24 people, and the people who come are the actual chief executives or the heads of, and come along and do this dialogue, and they take off their hats in terms of the fact they might be the head of the Consumer Association and talk from their own perspective about what are the big issues. And these are the type of themes. No surprise in any of these themes, I don't think. But as I said, for the sake of today, it's very summarised. And on the right-hand side are just some of the issues falling out of those, and which very much form our agenda of the type of emerging issues, materiality issues that we seek to look at in terms of framing our interface. As I said, this is from last year's report. This year's is going to be a little bit different on how we map to the performance indicators, but it's only to say that what we do is we do use the global frameworks, but then use the Australian-based stakeholders to define local stakeholder priorities. An example of that, for example, from the union side in this country, it's not so much an issue right at the moment, but the extent of overtime worked in the company. The extent to which you were screwing down on workforce numbers, but actually working people harder, and you're doing extensive overtime in the company, which can get into occupational health and safety issues, was a big issue for the unions in this country, and hence we have metrics around that. Another area was the relativities of male and female salary relativities for doing exactly the same work. Again, not an issue for us in the sense that we don't have any discrimination on pay for job, whether, but historically that was there. I notice that's now in GRI anyway, but there were a number of other areas which can be issues in the domestic context but aren't necessarily on the global framework, so I just want to mention that. On the reporting structure, as I said, the stakeholder priorities do drive our report. And I'll show you an example, we've sought to, in a simple way, try to demonstrate the shareholder value linkages better this year. I think that's very important that we do that, because at the end of the day, unless this is, in fact, in the interest of the company as a whole, and therefore the shareholders, then you have to ask why you're doing it. Directors don't have the ability to just do good things if there is, in fact, not in the interest of the corporation. Having said that, these things link very strongly to value generation for the corporation, so that doesn't actually become an issue. We're reporting in 5 key sectors under employees, customers, environment, social and suppliers. We do set out clear report cards on our progress and targets, and we also very intensively try to use case studies to bring to life actual examples of sustainability in practice, because a lot of people, very few people, want to read the nitty-gritty detail of this stuff, but they may get excited by actually seeing sustainability or sustainable business practices actually in play and how it works. And we actually, our report very much these days is done not unlike an annual financial report, in as much as we put all the quantitative data into what we call our fact pack, but it's actually a set of accounts, a set of social and environmental and financial accounts. And I'll show you some examples. So, don't try to read that. That list of people there is actually who's on the Community Consultative Council. And so one of the first sections you'll see in this report, which will go to print next week, so it'll be out very soon, talks about our sustainability priorities and the emerging agenda. And here you'll find that we'll actually be reporting back on, you can see issues on different community debt and financial literacy, indigenous disadvantage, work-life balance, climate change, environmental performance, all of the issues which are coming out of that agenda from the Community Consultative Council. So they set the priorities and we report back in that. Now this is just a snapshot up the front, and then throughout the report you get more detail. This is the type of thing we've done to try to link the shareholder value linkage in a very simple and engaging way. I hope you can read it there. Didn't reproduce that well. But on the environmental space, for example, we do this in each sector. You can see they're managing our environmental footprint. Why? Because it reduces waste, it improves efficiency, and it reduces risk for the company. Very simple, very clear value linkages. And in that sense, it creates financial value to us. If we do it well, it creates social value and it creates environmental value. In some of the other areas, they don't create environmental value, they just create social or financial. So it varies. So we're throughout our report, we've got these simple schematics linking, trying to show the value linkages, because sometimes this debate has been missed a little bit. As I said, we actively use case studies. Another example from the report that's coming out. This is simply one we got our business area to launch a major part of our Great Paper Chase program, but to launch e-statement project is the only one that any bank has done in this country yet. It's been amazing, the opt-in level. And what we said was that we would reinvest a significant part of the savings back into investing in carbon sinks and so on, and so, which is in reality for us major tree planting. And we've been able to work with Landcare to find some really sensitive areas of this country, quite historic, that needed regeneration and stuff. And so there's a whole loop here that starts with people being able to manage their accounts online to say, no, don't send me any more paper statements. I can view 3 years of history at any point, any time. And what they do is they get a simple email message each month that says, this month's statement's there if you want to go look at it. Most accounts you can see daily transactions anyway. But so the savings are enormous. The savings are big to us from this, but also the ability to reinvest that back in environmental initiatives. So it's just one example where there's text over here, but not a lot of text. We try to keep these things relatively simple and demonstrate very simple examples. This is again just a couple of snapshots out in our report. It's very important, I think, to set out clear objectives. So a to-do list, simple stuff, a to-do list for 2006. Again, so in the environmental space, what we're seeking to do. We do set aspirational targets as well, and we are quite happy to fall short of those, because if we don't fall short of them, they weren't very aspirational. So quite often in this report you'll find little crosses. In other words, we didn't get there on the report card, so that when we report back the prior year. So what happened against it? What we said in last year's report. So in 2005, which is this year, we're reporting on against the 2004 objectives, but setting so these on that report card are what we had in there as the to-dos for 2005. So we're actually reporting back, and so we do have crosses, we do have in progress, because if this is not truly aspirational or stretching, then and you get ticks everywhere, well, you've just set the target a bit low. This is just a snapshot of the type of stuff that we do in terms of what I've said, really the account. So we try again to put it in pretty simple terms and not to put too, even though that looks like a lot of detail, but not too much detail. So you go through this, there is literally a set of environment and social and customer and employee accounts. So it's very easy to go and look at the actual quantitative data as we run through the report. I just want to say, before we can have a dialogue, that assurance is critically important, and we've actively embraced Accountabilities AA1000 assurance principles, and for some of you who don't know this, it's built on three pillars, I guess: the pillar of completeness, materiality, and then responsiveness. And I think the middle one, which I'll talk about, the materiality issue. This is we've heard John Elkin talk about carpet bombing in a lot of this stuff. And if I've got a criticism of GRI, it's like having just filled out the mapping to the detailed GRI indicators, where you can find every indicator in our report. In fact, you can't find in the social impact report, but you can find it either in the financial report, on the website, or in what we call our principles of doing business, etc., etc. But a hell of a complex mapping, unbelievable. And it's fine for us, we're nearly a decade into this stuff. But I just think of a new company starting up. There's no training rules in this stuff, and that's why we're starting to see GRI, and I know in the UK, BITC with the CRI are also looking at light versions or trainer wheel versions, because previously, when you wanted to opt into this, congratulations, you're in the A League automatically, and you're going to be judged against everybody else, and it's a pretty daunting and not actually very constructive experience. So there's still some way to go on this, and that's why I think the issues of material are important. And I just might mention very briefly the global cement industry, which have real issues on sustainability in front of them, because they are probably one of the most energy intense industries that exist. It's incredibly energy and then carbon intense. They've got together under the auspices of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and they've actually all agreed to sign up to report. And they ended up in saying there's two issues for them. There's two big issues. One is the climate change issues, etc., and the second one is occupational health and safety. The rest are all crap. I mean, they're not that important, but they're the two fundamental issues for that industry. And they have, I think, 12 indicators. There might be a couple of sub ones, but it's a maximum of 15. And they do not want to engage, and are not going to get caught up with the ISO developments or with GRI, because they say their issues are to work on the real material issues. And I think they half got it right. So somewhere into this, we've got to get some realism. Because what you'll find is, if you say now to be compliant with GRI, you actually have to use a set of words in the CEO's statement at the front of the report. And if you don't use that set, and it's actually a predefined set of words, and then it has to meet all these other things. And then, so in some way, we are making this an exclusive club, and I'm not sure that's what the game's all about. So, having said that, we're active participants in GRI, or we are friends of GRI, and these debates are actively being had, but I think it's good. Okay. We actually also work quite hard now to work to parallel run our financial and non-financial assurance processes. It was interesting when we started. People thought, who's this strange social auditor? Who's Richard Buller, who does our social auditing? Who's he? And it was fascinating. When our finance people, audit people, actually saw the processes that were followed, they back modelled some of that stuff into the financial auditing and so on. Richard sits down, our auditors, our environmental auditors, they actually sit down with the chairman, they sit down with David, they sit down with group execs, they sit down with people out in the branches, they sit down with people in our call centres, and really get to understand what is the degree of understanding the company around these issues. Just because the company says it's doing something, is it really doing something? Where has it actually gone down through the company? Is there comprehensive response to the issues? Or is it spinning it? Is it just a snow job, greenwash or something? So it goes on. We've also set up an assurance advisory panel and took a subgroup out of our Community Consultative Council. And interesting enough, I thought that they'd be too busy. Well, no. We've had no trouble to get them to volunteer. Okay. Yep. And so they come on and do an independent review and endorsement of the non-financial assurance methodology. So we don't just... So who's checking the checkers is the issue. So we actually do check the checkers. I won't go into this, you can look at it later, but it's just the assurance process in practice and what it seeks to do, and these are some of the questions which are actually asked and addressed via it. And so, as I said, you can look at that later or go to WA1000 and have a look at the material around the assurance process. And again, I'll just say very quickly, who's rating the raters? We've actually developed a protocol, quite a detailed protocol, and sent it out for discussion. And the protocol is developed to ensure the independence, integrity and transparency of external ratings. In Europe, there is a development called the European Voluntary Quality Standard. It hasn't come into force yet, but it is a set of protocols of which external sustainability ratings houses will agree to operate under, because quite honestly, they were expecting an awful lot of companies that were rating and had zero transparency about their own processes. Some of their processes, the way that they assess companies and actually their scoring methodology weren't independently assured. So we've developed a protocol which say if you want to rate us, then you need to be operating at this sort of standard so that we can never expose our own selves to somebody who's saying that rating is not actually independent and you've actually bought it or you've done, or there's some conflict of interest issue here. So it's an interesting development. It's a bit controversial, but I think we will find very quickly the development of a standard set of protocols in this space so that the public can have greater assurance as to the independence of these so-called independent ratings. Finally, last one, David. So what are the issues here? On report content, I think there's some issues here about the relationship with assurance, the developments around ISO, where that's going to head, the OECD principles, the global compact frameworks. And so there's a lot of competition and competing here. So people will, if you get into this, you struggle with report content. How do you map to all this stuff? We attempt to do it, but let me say it'll be great when we get harmonisation, convergence, like the space. But there's a lot of debate towards that. So that's one of the challenge issues. The format of reports. How do you really satisfy diverse stakeholders? How do we better engage financial markets around this? Because if we don't, this will all be for nothing anyway, because the transmission mechanisms on corporate behaviour will come largely back not only by public pressure, but also by the fact that financial markets start valuing this stuff. How to get started. My CEO, David, who just had to read the final version of our latest stakeholder impact report, said, "It's fantastic, but bloody hell, it's long, and it's, can we shorten it? It's a real issue." And so even internally, we struggle with the complexity and detail. Credibility. Again, can companies afford the cost to really hire and bring in external assurance providers? This is not cheap, because to do an assurance process, you can't do it in a day. Our assurance process takes about a month and a half. So if you've got diverse operations all over the country and there's material issues potentially in each of those, then it's a very costly process. So there are issues about it. the one I mentioned, completeness versus materiality, full and frank disclosure, and comparability of reports. Completeness versus participation and critical mass issues, and finally ratings and assessments. A lot of people are concerned about questionnaire fatigue, quality assurance and some of that. That's the protocol issues I've talked about to get better standardisation or more confidence. That the latest one that shows up says they're producing sustainability ratings. How do you know that there's integrity in the process? How do you know that it's being applied uniformly across each company that they're rating? How do you know that their own procedures are being properly audited? How do you know that the data you might give them is protected and if it's commercially sensitive? So a lot of issues. Okay, and that's all I had to say.
Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions. I'd like to kick off with one question myself first of all, and it just goes back. I'm making the assumption that your data collection is questionnaire based, because you, in fact, in the program itself, you spoke about questionnaire fatigue. Going right back to basics, and even if you're the CEO, the same things like keeping the decks down. I mean, have you done simple things like factor analysis to make sure that you're using correlation matrices to see when you can squash down those areas that are highly correlated?
It's a good question, David. No, it's not questionnaire based at all. There are components which are, for example, the employee dimension. There are certain things we report in the employee space which you can only collect by employees telling you what they think about the company, the integrity of the company, the degree of which they're engaged and committed, etc. But most of it's not. It comes out of the inherent systems within. So occupational health and safety just flows out of. A lot of the stuff exists in corporations already. Some doesn't. All the reporting around the environmental footprint. So from paper usage to electricity to airline travel to car travel, blah blah blah. It's not that difficult to get systems to aggregate that and report it back. Employee turnover. Overtime used, customer complaints, all that. So a lot of it just comes out of your standard systems that exist. It's a matter of getting the disciplines to assemble it properly and setting the systems up around that. As to whether you can use factor analysis and things to try to summarise things down, the problem of this is that there's not one indicator in there that some stakeholder or some group doesn't want to see and doesn't want in detail. So I think the issue is, I think the reports will get a bit simpler when people get more confident that they can access the greater detail on the web through much more of a search post as opposed to putting it into print. Just so you know, we used to print more, but now at one stage the board were keen to put the report in every branch and make it available to customer base. No one wanted to pick up this complex report. So we're looking at producing a brochure type real summary of it. We print 4,000 of them, by the way, at the moment. And again, that's not cheap, given it's a 60 or 70-page report. And we use, but that's because the global community in this area, there are quite a lot of demand. But it's not the type of product that we don't give to shareholders. If they want to, they know it's available, and it's all available to view on the website dynamically, or they can ring up and get a copy. But we couldn't justify it for sustainability reasons to give them a copy. Too costly, too much paper wastage, etc. So, but it's a good question. Look, eventually a lot of this stuff will just occur dynamically all the time. It'll be available and less demand on the annual reporting.
I've been getting to the facts.
Yep.
Noel, I'm interested in the sort of governance structure that you showed in the diagram, where you had a CSR team interacting with.
Yep.
And I was wondering, you also noted that the issues raised by the community consultation committee were then reflected in the report and there was some responsiveness there. I was just wondering about the role of that CSR committee, or the CSR team,
yep,
reports to the CSR committee on the board. Whether is there sort of remit to ensure that these issues are taken on board and where appropriate, real processes and systems to put in place to address them, or is their task simply to respond in the report? And is that team a permanent team or just a
No. In our case, it's permanent, and their remit is to actually make sure that whatever happens at board level or through the Community Consultative Council happens. But our approach is to embed it, is not to have this as an add-on. We've worked very hard for this to be mainstream, just simply part of how you do business in our place. For example, the supply chain work. In the early years, we were very, very heavily involved with our strategic sourcing area in the company to get them started. And we actually held their hand through, and we actually have our own sustainability risk assessment with our core suppliers. We've started with the top 100, which cover about 80% of our actually 3 odd billion of supply chain purchases. But they now run that assessment process. They chair the supply chain or the supplier forum. But we're still involved. I mean, the team's still involved. But once we can get processes embedded, the stuff we did on the Equator Principles, of course we had to be the core driver initially and got the bank to sign up to that. But it's now owned in project management. So they conduct their own training, they do the reporting. We assemble the reporting then, and if issues arise, we'll get involved. If they get involved in a sensitive project that looks like it's got environmental sensitivity, they'll bring us in and we'll consult and talk about the issues. We got involved in the decision in our SRI funds to actually put uranium back into the issue around BHP when they bought Western Mining, etc. And should uranium be absolutely screened out? And that debate is running very hard on the climate change issue. If you know the numbers in this, you'll know that we cannot exclude that energy source completely. It is, so it's back on the table, and we are trying to get a balance. So BT is, I should say. But we get involved in those issues, but in that it's their accountability, their decision. We can't confuse that. So we partner a lot, but our process is to embed and do ourselves out of a job. But we never will, of course. So if that answers your question, yeah.
Any questions? I might just have one more. And I hope you didn't cover this when I was taken to the back. In fact, what I'll do is I'll tell you why I was taken to the back. For the presenters and the other presenters here, we need to leave the trace of your presentation on the laptop, or alternatively, if you have a DVD.
I've got one you can keep, yeah.
Okay, because I'll just burn it.
Yeah, and I'll leave it here as well.
Okay, thanks very much. That's for all the other presenters as well. In terms of questionnaire fatigue, I suppose one of the things that I've experienced a lot in my life as a consultant is that there's a lot of duplication in reporting. And one of the most frustrating things from the point of view of a person who's been surveyed or being asked questions, whatever is the response they say, but I've already been asked that in another context.
Yep.
So I think it's very, fairly important that people make sure there's not too much duplication. Or alternatively, part of the seeking of the data, if it happens to be for an index related to corporate social responsibility, if it's already been done in another guise, accept what's already there in that guise and bring it out. Do you take that approach, or is there a lot of duplication?
No, there's been a huge amount of duplication, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. For example, if I use the CRI, the Corporate Responsibility Index, this year, I know they're coming to speak. Everybody's got back last year's. They're pre-populated everything with your last year's return, so you can really add to rather than completely report again. Again, Dow Jones Sustainability Index has got a bit better like that. Reputex has moved to ongoing ratings, so in fact they don't do an annual questionnaire anymore. But they may well come and say they've got concerns on, say, work practices or whatever, and seek more information. Or if you think you've improved, you can obviously engage the rater. But so I think it's improving, but it was where the questionnaire fatigue came from was that every year you get this unbelievable questionnaire. And it wasn't just the questionnaire. You had to validate and verify everything. And so, I'm not kidding. Our things will be this big, from reports to detail, because otherwise they say, well, we don't know if it's true. So you had to solve for sure in a sense, but you had to send them so much information. People, give you an example, companies starting to do, say, the CRI for the first time, say it can take them 2 people, 3 months' work. So it's not easy to start this initially, and that's my issue about making everybody do the Rolls-Royce first up. I think we're now getting traction around people saying, perhaps we need to find entry-level stuff for 1 or 2 years, and then people will want to do the more details. They realise the value it's creating. So, and we've found that through our supply chain work. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. It's,
So,
one
quick one,
last
yep.
question.
Just a little about communicating what you're doing both to your staff and to the external community. I can imagine it's a very big challenge to explain the terminology so many those fintech entrepreneurs and to put it into something that's consumable almost. How do you think that?
Look, it's an ongoing challenge. The language here is really confusing. The whole concept of corporate responsibility is confusing because it sounds like an externally imposed obligation. David's tried to do it with his work in his book and so on by using the word opportunity. It's just an ongoing challenge. People ask you it's a lot of cups of coffee. It's a lot of communication. It's just. But I think what's helping is that little schematic when you do that little value chain stuff, little things like that. People go, wow. Very quickly, I talked to our people in performance, another word for now what human resource areas are called these days, and I went to the nitty-gritty about that they're doing sustainable every day, and I used real examples of the people working on employee retention and what the drivers of that. That's a critical driver of this stuff. The ones working on the cultural work around employee engagement, the people working on remuneration, absolutely critical issues in this whole space. So when you get to that, they suddenly will, oh, I do this every day. Yes, you do. It's not volunteering in the community. It is how you conduct your business. Do you do it ethically or do you not? Do you do it in a stakeholder responsive fashion or not? Do you try and drive value or not? It's simple.